Are there any Japanese folk in the room? Any? No. Well, I'm glad. Because after watching the Springboks play the Japanese last week, I can never tell who's Japanese and who isn't. But I heard after the Japs got knocked out, they all gone home. Okay, that was my weak attempt at humor. You can tell I'm an auditor, because we're not very good at jokes. Okay, so my job is to basically give you an idea what the RTMS standard requires for a company to be certified. Paul has laid a good foundation in terms of explaining the reasons for it. And if you look at Exaro's logo, it's powering possibility. And what Tolisi said in his introduction, why do we accept crashes and fatalities? It seems we've become immune to it. Is it possible that a project like RTMS or other projects can be the catalyst for us to change transport, to change the situation on the roads? And that brings me to the whole concept of self-regulation. And so RTMS requires a change in mindset. So in addition to the effort of law enforcement, it requires a company to take ownership for its activities on a public road. So RTMS is a South African national standard, and the standard prescribes certain requirements for transport operators as well as consignors and consignees. The content is written by the SABS Technical Committee 241, and on that committee are various stakeholders from government, private sector, and other relevant stakeholders. So the old standard was specifically for transport operators, but now the revised version includes consignor and consignee requirements. The section 4 is specific to transport operators, and there are 13 elements. Each element prescribes a rule, if you want to call it that, indicating what would one need to implement in order to meet the requirements of the standard. Clause 5 takes into account consignors and consignees. So if you're a consignor, such as an Exaro or a Coke or an SAB or any other company that receives goods and offers goods for transport, then element 5 of the standard is what one would need to comply with. So the main focus today is to look at what are the requirements for transport operators, and these would also be applicable to consignees and consignors who run their own fleets or who use subcontractors or transport operators. The standard can broadly be classified into 4 main pillars. Fleet and loading, there's safety and compliance, and by now you would have gathered that RTMS, one of the main focuses of the standard is how do we promote safety and compliance. Safety in terms of safe driving behavior. We know that globally, anything between 70 to 80% of crashes is due to driver-related issues. Vehicle maintenance, another critical factor, and Paul showed the quite worrying statistics in terms of almost 70% of trucks on our roads are not safe enough in terms of brakes and tires. So the standard looks at these 4 pillars, and one would need to have various policies, procedures, and monitoring tools to both implement the requirements and to monitor and maintain compliance. So what I'd like to do is just go through some of the main elements in the standard and summarize what typically one would need for an audit. I can't go through every single element because of time constraints, but on the RTMS website, there are a fair amount of resources, and if you have other questions, you're more than welcome to log an inquiry via the website. So those of you who are certified will know that RTMS is awarded on a per site or per depot basis. So when one makes an application, one would need to define which sites you are wanting certified, and one would also need to define a specific number of vehicles that would fall under certification. So one could choose to have a certain number of sites or and a certain number of vehicles under your RTMS certification. If you have subcontractors or if you have owner drivers, then you could decide to include those entities under certification or not. So that is discretionary, but if one does include them, then they will need to be managed as if they are your own fleet. Overload prevention is a critical requirement in the standard. Besides the obvious negative impact on the road infrastructure, it also, if a vehicle is overloaded, it makes that vehicle extremely unsafe. Your braking efficiency is compromised, the actual vehicle dynamics is affected negatively, so overloading is undesirable. The standard, the RTMS standard requires for a company to implement a defined method that clearly indicates how is that vehicle loaded in order to comply with your legal limits in terms of your combination mass, and also indicate how do you comply with the relevant axle mass limits, or how do you make provision for that. You will remember that in terms of the consignee regulations, this is a requirement that's been legislated 2 or 3 years back. So one could use various methods of loading. So you could use physical weigh if you are lucky enough to have a weigh bridge on site. One could load by unit mass, or you could load by volume. So the standard does not prescribe a specific technology or system. So you would determine based on your company size and resources how you would define your method for complying with the requirements. Typically for an audit, those of you who've been through it will know this, the auditor will select a sample of trips from your fleet. He or she will request the source documents such as weighbridge tickets or delivery notes or other evidence to confirm that that vehicle was loaded in compliance with the legal limits. So here's an example. If you're the bulk commodities sector, here weigh bridges are installed in all the mines, so you would need to keep copies of each trip, and one would need to record what are the tonnages for each trip conducted. And what is important is that the overloading percentage must be quantified on a monthly basis. And I think if you look at the limitations of law enforcement, I mean, there are only a certain number of weigh bridges, and not all the route networks has a weigh bridge. With the RTMS standard, it requires that every truck, every trip must be monitored so that one has a quantified measure of the percentage of overloading, if any. And if in fact there is overloading, it needs to be addressed so that overloading is minimized over a period of time. And we've seen some really good results, which again Paul has shown in timber, in the sugar industry, and also in the mining sector, where overloading has been reduced significantly. The second requirement in that element is load securement. You know, if one looks at trucks on the roads nowadays, I mean, I'm just surprised how often there's either limited or sometimes no adequate load securement. And those are pictures that you see that are not uncommon on our road networks. Here again, a method needs to be in place indicating how do you secure the load, number of straps if you're doing abnormal loads, how do you position the load. So all of the details of securement will need to be defined. The auditor again will take a sample and look at, have you loaded the vehicle according to the policy or procedures you have. We know that, again, in terms of crashes, one of the most, or the biggest contributor to crashes is traveling at inappropriate speeds. So compliance with the speed regulation is a requirement of the standard. So one would need to have a method indicating what is your policy. The policy must ensure that it promotes compliance to the relevant road speed. So if it's an 80 kilometer zone or a 60, the policy must ensure it makes provision for compliance with the relevant road speed. Really important is to ensure that all trips are monitored every day, every kilometer. And of course with telematics, that's quite an easy thing to do nowadays. What isn't always implemented is detection of all speed violations. So one would need to have an exception report making you aware of the number of speed violations on a weekly, monthly basis as well, and there needs to be adequate consequence management for all speed violations. And this is again about changing behavior and changing culture. So if one thinks about speed, it's something that is very common, especially not just in heavy vehicles, but in most, even with light motor vehicles. So when a person exceeds the speed limit, often there isn't an immediate impact. So he will do it once, and he will do it twice, and he keeps repeating the negative behavior, thinking there's no consequence, until after repeated non-compliance, something bad happens on the road. So the RTMS standard, if you look at all the elements, it's designed to have a policy, to monitor the policy, and to detect negative behavior before it results in a crash or collision on the road. And of course, when a crash happens, it's too late then. So here's an example of a typical telematics report, or an output of that. There needs to be monitoring and detection of speed violations, and there needs to also be an indication that adequate corrective actions have been implemented. So when the auditor comes on site, he will take a sample of trucks. Say he'll take 10 vehicles out of maybe 50. He will request to have access to telematics data for those 10 trucks over a month, and he will look at the data and evaluate if there is any non-compliance, and if there is, have you internally detected the non-compliance, and have you implemented actions to mitigate those negative behaviors. So self-regulation requires that one monitors and implements action where there are anomalies or negative behavior. The standard also requires for there to be a structured method whereby all crashes, collisions are investigated, so that one understands what are the main contributory factors to a crash or collision, so that you can identify what are the trends. Is there a specific aspect of the business that's causing a high incident rate? Is there a high risk that could result in load shifting or crashes or other risk factors? So the whole idea of accident investigation is to determine what are the main root causes, and then to implement actions or change of policy or do something to mitigate what the finding is. We know that vehicles are often or can be neglected. The standard here makes very defined requirements for vehicles, and here one would need to have a vehicle maintenance schedule in place. The schedule or maintenance schedule will need to make provision for trucks, for motorized vehicles, and for trailers. We know that trucks are usually time-based intervals. So usually it's, in this case, it's a 25,000 interval. For trailers, it's a kilometer-based interval. For trailers, it's normally time-based interval, unless they are married combinations. So what we need to have a schedule in place, and from the schedule, the auditor will then request job cards or invoices to confirm that for each scheduled interval, the kilometers at which the vehicle was serviced on that interval is in fact within the tolerance allowed. The other requirement in the standard is for there to be a daily vehicle pre-trip inspection conducted. This should be a safety check. In other words, the driver or somebody responsible would need to check that truck, and if there are any critical or safety defects found, that vehicle should not be allowed to operate until it has been repaired and it's declared safe to be on the road. Fatigue management, we had a SABS TC meeting yesterday, and again it was found that there's a high or increasing number of crashes and collisions due to inadequate management of driver fatigue. And here the standard requires for there to be a fatigue policy. The policy needs to make provision for driver rest days, so days that he's not on site or not on shift. The policy needs to make provision for the maximum number of shift hours for the day. It should indicate, if he's in a long distance trip, how many hours can he drive continuously? Because he might come to work at 5 a.m., ready and quite fresh to drive, but if he's driving 7 hours continuously, say from Durban to Cape Town, the monotony of that journey can cause fatigue, even though he was quite ready in the morning. So the policy needs to make provision for all of that. And one needs to also, and you'll see later on in the next element, education and awareness is a critical component of RTMS. So for driver fatigue, when the driver goes home at say 6 p.m. in the evening, how do we know that he has actually slept when he's gotten home? We don't. When he comes on shift in the morning, we assume that he slept for 6 or 7 hours. What if he hasn't slept and he comes to work fatigued already? You wouldn't know that. There's no way you can tell, you can check on that. So the education and awareness, giving the driver the knowledge he needs to take responsibility for managing his own health and wellness, that's a critical component of the RTMS. So he must be made aware, if he doesn't have sufficient sleep, the impact it will have on him. So it's really quite a holistic system, and it's not purely about monitoring, but it's about also changing culture through awareness initiatives. Driver wellness, here the standard requires for there to be a medical fitness policy in place. The policy will need to indicate how do you manage drivers with chronic illnesses, such as diabetes or hypertension or other illnesses they might have. The awareness should include, like I said, fatigue. It should make them aware of diet or nutrition. Drugs and alcohol, we know is a problem that needs to be communicated to the drivers, especially with the new or fairly recent legislation around cannabis and consumption of cannabis. So if the driver consumes it at his house and then comes to work, you've got to have a system in place of managing that and making the driver aware of the dangers of that situation. And he's got to have an idea, if he does have a chronic illness, of how does he manage it adequately, and you as a company will need to also do some checks and balances to validate that the risk factor associated with chronic illnesses is under control and managed. Driver licenses, that's it's a given requirement. The driver needs to have the correct class of license for the vehicle being driven. There should be a really structured training plan in place to ensure that the drivers are competent, not just has a license, but is he competent to drive the vehicles continuously, and the training should make provision for defensive driving. There should be verification records the auditor can look at, such as certificates or awareness programs or other in-house programs that may be available. The training does not need to be external. And from what we've seen, the most effective programs are where the training has been integrated into the company culture. So you've got awareness posters, you've got videos, you've got the fleet controllers involved. So it needs to be holistic and not just an academic training in order to reach the maximum effectiveness of the initiatives. Like any audit, there needs to be various documents and records available. Like I mentioned, policies, procedures, work instructions, etc. There should also be records, historical records of compliance, which will be crucial for the audit. Because the auditor will look at, yes, your policies and procedures, but he will also look at the actual records, trip sheets, service records, overloading, weighbridge tickets, and all of the other stuff, medical certificates, that needs to confirm that the policies and procedures have been complied with consistently. There are quite a few management type functions in the standard. So monitoring of all the KPIs is a requirement. There needs to be an annual internal audit be conducted to validate that the system is being implemented as required. There ought to be an annual management review, and the goal of continual improvement is obviously a requirement. So that's a summary of the operator requirements. So if you're a consignor or consignee, then the three boxes on the slide indicate the three possible means that you need to implement. The one is if you have your own fleet, then all the requirements of clause 4 would apply. So all the stuff I've been through now, if you do have your own fleet, one would need to implement those requirements. If you use RTMS certified operators in your business, then you need to keep copies of their certificates. And if as a consignor or consignee, you have non-RTMS certified operators, then one would need to be responsible as a consignor for obtaining all the data that confirms that your transporter or subcontractor is compliant with the requirements. So you can see if you are using non-certified operators, it does place an additional admin on the consignor to get all of that data and to have it available for the audit. So there are some additional requirements for consignors and consignees. So loading, so if you're a consignor or consignee, before the truck leaves, have you validated that you're complying with the mass limits and load securement? Before the truck is dispatched, there needs to be a dispatch authorization validating mass and dimensions and load securement. In terms of access, before you allow a truck onto your mine, onto your manufacturing site, one would need to verify the truck is legal in terms of the mass limits and roadworthiness. And finally, at the end, we know that cycle time is often a problem, especially in the mining sector, where trucks go to a mine to load, for example, and they wait 4, 5, 17 hours sometimes in queue. So the last element in the standard for consignor or consignee is hoping to promote a more efficient cycle time. And here the consignor would need to monitor queuing time, loading time, and exit time, and hopefully promote more efficiency in that supply chain. The RTMS website, rtms.co.za, so companies who are certified would need to, on the website, at the bottom there, but on the bottom, on your bottom left, there's a submission for a quarterly report. So if you are certified, those of you who are certified will submit that every calendar quarter. You submit the overloading stats, number of speed violations, number of crashes, number of driver fatigue issues. So all the KPIs that provide the assurance that safety is being continually promoted will need to be submitted. And what we have seen, and what's quite encouraging, is that over the last number of years, companies who are RTMS certified have shown excellent results in terms of reduction in crashes, overloading, reduced number of speed violations, etc. And obviously this is an important part of the RTMS certification, is in addition to the annual audits, there's an ongoing system where one is compelled to disclose your statistics to confirm continual compliance. Yeah, that's it. So I hope that's given you a good idea as to what the RTMS standard requires. And I'm not sure we'll take questions later on, Adrian. Okay, thank you very much.